Sometimes the most desperate souls find each other when hope seems lost forever. In the fading light of an autumn evening in 1891 Colorado Territory, cattleman Coulter Hayes discovers a woman named Ella Harper beneath a broken wagon, abandoned, and starving with nothing left but the clothes on her back. She has no money, no family, and believes she has no future worth seeing another sunrise. When Coulter wraps his duster around her trembling shoulders and whispers those 4 simple words, "You're safe with me," neither of them realizes this moment will change everything. What starts as one lonely soul offering shelter to another becomes something far more extraordinary when Ella reveals an unusual gift. She can predict weather patterns and water flows with uncanny accuracy, a skill that could save Coulter's drought-stricken ranch and every desperate cattleman on the high plains. But their newfound hope faces a deadly threat when the vindictive showman who once claimed Ella as property returns with hired guns and legal writs, determined to drag her back into a life of servitude. Can 2 broken hearts find the courage to fight for a future together when everything they've built hangs in the balance? The broken spokes of that wagon wheel still haunted Coulter Hayes 3 days later as he stood on the wraparound porch of the Hay Bar H ranch house, watching steam rise from his coffee cup in the crisp morning air. The woman Ella, she'd whispered her name like a prayer lay, sleeping in his parents' old room, finally free from the fever that had racked her body since he'd carried her home through the violet dusk, Coulter's weathered hands wrapped around the tin cup, feeling the familiar weight of his father's branding iron hanging from his belt. Thomas Hayes had carried that iron for 37 years, building the spread from nothing but stubbornness and sweat. Now it belonged to Coulter, along with the debts, the drought-cracked earth, and the echo of voices that would never again call this place home. The ranch stretched before him in the pale, dawn-light 1,500 acres of high prairie that had once supported 300 head of prime beef cattle. These days, he was lucky to keep 50 alive through the endless dry spell that had gripped the Colorado Territory for 2 grinding years. The creek that had run clear and cold through the center of the property now showed nothing but white stones, and the occasional muddy puddle that disappeared before noon dot his mother's vegetable garden, once the pride of the valley, lay withered behind the house. Martha Hayes had possessed green thumbs that could coax tomatoes from dust, but even her stubborn optimism couldn't have survived this relentless sun. Coulter had tried to maintain it after the fever took both his parents last winter, but caring for plants required a gentleness he'd never quite mastered. His hands were better suited to rope and leather, to the hard work of keeping cattle alive when nature seemed determined to kill everything that drew breath. The sound of bare feet on wooden floors drew his attention back to the house. Through the window, he could see Ella moving carefully through the kitchen, one hand trailing along the wall for support. She'd been unconscious for most of the past 3 days, surfacing only long enough to sip the beef broth he'd spooned between her cracked lips. Seeing her upright sent a mixture of relief and concern through his chest. He pushed through the screen door, the hinges singing their familiar song, "You shouldn't be on your feet yet." Ella turned toward his voice, and for the first time, he saw her clearly in good light. She couldn't be more than 25, with auburn hair that caught the morning sun streaming through the kitchen window. Her face bore the gaunt hollows of long hunger, but her green eyes held a clarity that spoke of intelligence and determination. The calico dress she wore, one of his mother's that he'd found in the cedar chest, hung loose on her thin frame, but she carried herself with a dignity that poverty couldn't touch. "I've been enough trouble already," she said, her voice still, hoarse from fever. "The least I can do is make myself useful." "Trouble?" Coulter shook his head, settling his coffee cup on the kitchen table his father had built from salvaged barn wood. "Lady, you've been sick as a dog. That's not trouble, that's just circumstance." She studied him with those keen eyes, taking in his tall frame, the sun-weathered face beneath dark hair that needed cutting, the careful way he moved around her as if she might bolt like a spooked mare. "You don't know anything about me. I could be running from the law, or worse." "Could be," he agreed, pulling out a chair for her. "But I doubt it. Folks running from the law don't usually collapse from starvation, aside broken-down wagons. They find better ways to hide. Ella accepted the chair gratefully, though she kept her back straight with obvious effort. That medicine show I told you about Dr. Winter's Miracle Elixir Company. They weren't exactly legitimate. Coulter had figured as much. Traveling shows that abandoned their people on empty roads rarely were. What did they have you doing? Reading the crowd, she said. Quietly. Telling fortunes mostly. Winter said I had a gift for knowing what people wanted to hear. Her fingers traced the wood grain of the table. I suppose I did, after a fashion. But it wasn't the kind of gift that sits well with a person's conscience. A morning light shifted, casting longer shadows across the kitchen floor. Coulter had seen plenty of traveling shows roll through the territory over the years: patent medicine salesmen, fortune tellers, performers who promised magic and delivered disappointment. Most were harmless enough, selling hope to folks who had precious little of it. But some were darker, preying on desperation with practiced cruelty. How long were you with them? He asked. 3 years. Ella's voice carried the weight of those years like stones. Since my grandmother passed. She raised me after my parents died of cholera when I was 12. When she was gone, I had nowhere else to go. Winter found me in Denver, working in a boarding house kitchen for pennies and scraps. He promised steady meals and a roof over my head. And he kept those promises? After a fashion. She managed a bitter smile. I ate every day, but barely. Had a roof, but it was usually a leaky wagon cover. And the work. She shuddered. Telling desperate people that their dead loved ones forgave them, that better times were coming, that the bottle of colored water they were buying would cure everything from consumption to heartbreak. The worst part was how much they wanted to believe it. Coulter felt a familiar anger kindle in his chest, the same fire that had burned when he'd found her beside that broken wagon, abandoned like a piece of unwanted furniture. What made you finally leave? I didn't leave, Ella said softly. They left me, in Pueblo, 2 weeks ago. A woman died after taking Winter's elixir, and her husband came looking for answers with a shotgun. Winter decided the show needed to travel. Light and fast. Said I was too much trouble to keep around. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock that had kept faithful time through 3 generations of Hayes family breakfasts. Coulter found himself studying Ella's face, seeing past the hunger and exhaustion to the strength. Beneath, she'd survived years with charlatans and thieves, kept her dignity intact despite circumstances that would have broken weaker souls. Well, he said finally, you're not too much trouble for me. This place could use some life in it again. Something shifted in Ella's expression, a careful hope, like the first green shoots after a hard winter. I don't have any way to pay you back. No money, no family to send for me. I'm not even sure where I'd go if I could. Nobody's asking you to go anywhere, Coulter said. Far as I'm concerned, you can stay as long as you like. This spread's got plenty of room and precious few people to fill it. He stood and moved to the stove, where a pot of coffee had been keeping warm since before dawn. The routine of pouring, the familiar scrape of his boots on the wooden floor, gave him something to do with his hands while he found the right words. Truth is, he continued, I could use the company. Been rattling around this place alone since. My folks passed, and it gets mighty quiet. A man starts talking to his horse too much. He needs to consider that maybe he's the one who's lonesome. Ella's laugh was soft but genuine, the first real joy he'd heard from her. And here, I thought, I was the desperate one. Oh, you are plenty desperate, Coulter said, returning to the table with fresh coffee for both of them. But desperate's not the same as hopeless. Hopeless folks don't keep walking when their shoes fall apart. They don't keep breathing when everything hurts. You've got too much fight in you to be truly hopeless. The word seemed to surprise her, as if she'd never considered that survival itself might be a form of courage. She wrapped her hands around the warm coffee cup, and for a moment, the kitchen felt less empty than it had in months. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning dew and promising another day of relentless heat. But inside the Hayes kitchen, with its familiar smells of coffee and bacon grease, wood smoke and the lingering scent of his mother's lavender sachets, something new was taking root. Not quite friendship yet, and certainly not love, but the possibility of both fragile. As prairie grass after rain, but real enough to tend and nurture. There's something else, Ella said suddenly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Something I haven't told you. Coulter waited, recognizing the weight of secrets in her tone. My grandmother, she continued, she taught me things. Ways. Of reading the weather, of knowing when rain was coming days before the clouds showed. She called it bone-deep knowing, said it ran in our family like blue eyes or the shape of our hands. Weather sense? Coulter had heard of such things, though he'd never met anyone who claimed to possess it. Like knowing when storms are coming? More than that. Ella's fingers tightened around her cup. I can feel changes in the air, pressure shifts that mean water's moving underground. Sometimes I know where creeks will run before they break the surface. My grandmother could predict droughts and floods both, could tell ranchers where to dig wells and farmers when to plant. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath. If what she was saying was true, if she really could predict water in this drought-stricken country, then she might be the answer to prayers Coulter hadn't dared voice. The Hay-Bar H wasn't the only spread dying for lack of water. Half the territory was slowly bleeding cattle and watching dreams turn to dust. That's quite a gift, he said carefully. Gift. Ella's voice turned bitter. Winter called it that too. Used it to make his fortune-telling more impressive. She can see the future in the bones of the earth, he'd tell the crowds. But it's not the future I see. It's just patterns. The way air moves, the way the ground feels under my feet. Nothing mystical about it. Maybe not mystical, Coulter said, but valuable. Water's worth more than gold out here. That's what scares me. Ella met his eyes directly. People want to believe in magic, especially when they're desperate. But when they find out magic is just knowledge, just paying attention to things they never learned to see, they get angry. They feel cheated, even when the results are real. Coulter thought about his 50 head of cattle, about the neighboring ranchers who were selling off their herds for pennies on the dollar, about the wells that had gone dry, and the families packing up to try their luck elsewhere. If Ella could really find water, the knowledge would be worth a fortune. But it would also make her a target for every desperate soul in the territory. Well, he said finally, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, you just focus on getting your strength back. Everything else can wait. But even as he spoke the words, Coulter knew they weren't entirely true. The drought wouldn't wait. The bills wouldn't wait. And somewhere out there, Dr. Silas Winter was probably wondering what had happened to his fortune-telling girl, the one who could read weather in her bones and predict water like a divining rod made flesh. The morning was warming toward noon when Ella finally pushed back from the table, color returning to her cheeks for the first time since he'd found her. Thank you, she said simply. For the coffee, for the bed, for all of it. No thanks needed, Coulter replied, but he felt something settle in his chest at her words. Rightness he hadn't experienced since his parents' deaths. Like I said, this place needs some life in it. As Ella made her way carefully back to the bedroom to rest, Coulter stepped out onto the porch again, his father's branding iron heavy at his side. The land stretched before him, brown and thirsty under the relentless sun. But for the first time in months, he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was hope yet for the Hay-Bar H. And if there wasn't, well, at least he wouldn't face the failing alone. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning. Exactly 1 week after Coulter had brought Ella home. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house, moving with the careful efficiency of someone still rebuilding her strength. When the thunder of hoofbeats made her freeze with a damp sheet clutched in her hands, Coulter emerged from the barn, where he'd been mending harness leather, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt .45 on his hip. 3 riders approached from the east, their silhouettes dark against the morning sun. Even at a distance, he recognized the purposeful way they sat their saddles. This wasn't a social call. Ella, he called quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching men. Best come inside. But Ella had already dropped the sheet and taken several steps backward, her face drained of all color. It's him, she whispered. Dr. Winter. He found me. The lead rider was a man in his 50s, tall and lean with silver hair beneath a black hat. He wore a fine coat despite the heat, and his horse was better fed than most cattle in the territory. Behind him rode two younger men whose eyes swept the ranch with the cold calculation of hired guns. Coulter stepped between Ella and the approaching riders, his stance relaxed but ready. "Why don't you head inside?" he suggested again, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. This time, Ella listened, though she moved no farther than the kitchen window, where she could watch through the thin curtains. His mother had sewn 20 years ago. The three men reined up 10 feet from the porch, close enough to make their intentions clear but far enough to avoid seeming immediately threatening. Dr. Silas Winter, for it could be no one else, dismounted with theatrical grace and removed his hat, revealing sharp features and pale eyes. That missed nothing. "Good morning," Winter said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who made his living selling hope to the desperate. "I'm Dr. Silas Winter, and I believe you have something that belongs to me." Coulter remained on the porch, the extra height giving him a psychological advantage. "Can't say that I do. Everything on this ranch belongs to me or my family." Winter's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. You see, I've come to collect Miss Ella Harper, who owes me a considerable debt and left my employ without permission." "Funny thing about that," Coulter replied, his voice mild as summer rain. "The lady tells a different story. Says you abandoned her beside a broken wagon with no food, no money, and no way to get home." "The lady," Winter said, putting particular emphasis on the word, "is a known liar and thief. She stole from me and fled in the night, leaving me with substantial losses." From his coat, he produced a folded document with official-looking seals. "I have here a legal writ of debt collection, signed by the territorial marshal himself." Coulter's blood chilled as he recognized the seal and, worse, the signature. Marshal Frank Hayes, his own cousin, had signed the document. The same Frank who'd inherited the family tendency toward rigid thinking and bitter grudges, who'd never forgiven Coulter for choosing ranching over law enforcement. "That's interesting," Coulter said, though his mouth had gone dry. "Mind if I take a look at that paper?" Winter handed over the document with obvious satisfaction. "You'll find everything in order. Miss Harper owes me $300 in back wages, room and board, and damages to my equipment. The law is quite clear on the matter of debt collection." Coulter read the document carefully, his anger building with each line. The writ was legal enough, if one-sided. It claimed Ella had signed the contract agreeing to work off a debt of $300 a fortune for someone in her circumstances, and had fled before completing her obligation. "This says she signed this contract," Coulter said. "You have her signature on file?" "Naturally." Winter's confidence never wavered. "Though I hardly think a woman of her background would contest a legal document in open court." The threat was clear. Winter was betting that Ella wouldn't risk public scrutiny, that her desperation would make her compliant. He was counting on the same shame and fear that had kept her trapped with his medicine show for 3 years. "Well," Coulter said, handing back the paper, "I'm afraid you've wasted a trip. The lady's under my protection now, and she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Winter's mask of civility began to slip. "I'm afraid the law doesn't recognize your protection, Mr. Hayes. The marshal was quite clear about that. This debt must be satisfied, either through Miss Harper's return or payment in full." The casual use of his name sent a chill down Coulter's spine. Winter had done his research, knew exactly who he was dealing with. That meant he also knew about the ranch's financial troubles, about the back taxes that threatened to take the hay bar H. "And if I refuse?" Coulter asked. One of Winter's hired men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his gun. "The marshal mentioned that you've been having your own financial difficulties," Winter said smoothly. "Unpaid taxes, struggling cattle operation. It would be unfortunate if this matter required additional legal complications." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Winter wasn't just demanding Ella's return, he was threatening to use Coulter's own cousin against him, to pile legal troubles on top of an already desperate situation. From the kitchen window came the soft sound of something breaking, followed by Ella's muffled sob. She'd heard every word, understood exactly what Winter was offering, her freedom in exchange for Coulter's ruin. "I'll need some time to consider this," Coulter said finally. "Of course." Winter's smile returned, cold as winter moonlight. "I'm staying at the hotel in Pueblo. I'll expect an answer by tomorrow evening. After that, I'm afraid the marshal will have to take a more direct approach to collecting what's owed." The three men mounted their horses with the same theatrical precision they'd used to dismount. Winter touched the brim of his hat in a mockery of politeness. "Good day, Mr. Hayes. I do hope you'll make the sensible choice." Coulter remained on the porch until the riders disappeared beyond the eastern ridge, his mind racing through possibilities and finding precious few that didn't end in disaster. When he finally went inside, he found Ella sitting at the kitchen table, her hands folded tightly to stop their trembling. "I have to go back," she said without looking up. "I won't let him destroy you because of me. Like hell you will." Coulter's voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "No one's going back to that bastard. We'll find another way." "What? Other way?" Ella's laugh was bitter as wormwood. "You heard him. He has the law on his side. Your own cousin signed that paper." Coulter had been trying not to think about Frank, about the family rift that had festered for 15 years over a girl they both loved and lost to consumption. Frank had never forgiven him for Mary's choice, had nursed his bitterness through law school and into a marshal's badge that gave weight to his grudges. "Frank's got his reasons for wanting to hurt me," Coulter admitted, "but even he won't bend the law too far out of shape. There has to be something wrong with that contract, some way to fight it. And if there isn't?" Ella's green eyes held a desperation that cut him deeper than any blade. "What then? Do you lose everything because you are kind to a stranger?" The afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen window, casting long shadows across the floor where his parents had shared 30 years of meals and conversation. Coulter thought about his father's branding iron, about the weight of legacy and the cost of doing what was right versus what was practical. "I've been alone on this ranch for 8 months," he said quietly. "Alone with the ghosts and the memories, and the sound of my own voice echoing off empty walls. You think I'm going to give that up and go back to that loneliness just because some snake oil salesman waves a piece of paper at me?" Ella's facade cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You don't understand. Winter doesn't just want me back, he wants to own me. Completely. Body and soul. And he'll destroy anyone who gets in his way. Then we'll have to make sure he's the one who gets destroyed instead." The words surprised Coulter as much as they seemed to surprise Ella. He wasn't a violent man by nature, had spent his adult life building rather than tearing down. But something about Winter's casual cruelty, his assumption that desperation made people disposable, had awakened a cold anger that demanded satisfaction. "How?" Ella whispered. Coulter looked out the window at his drought-stricken land, at the cattle that depended on him for survival, at the legacy his parents had built with blood and sweat and stubborn hope. Then he looked at the woman who'd brought unexpected light into his empty house, who'd shared coffee and conversation and the promise that life might hold more than mere survival. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but we've got until tomorrow evening to figure it out." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and dying grass. But for the first time since his parents' death, Coulter Hayes felt truly alive, his blood singing with purpose. Winter had made a mistake in threatening what was his. Now the bastard would learn what it meant to corner a man who had nothing left to lose and everything worth fighting for. The war for Ella Harper's freedom was about to begin. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the prairie, Ella sat on the porch steps with a worn leather journal balanced on her knees. The book had belonged to her grandmother, its pages filled with decades of weather observations written in Sarah Harper's careful script. Coulter had never seen anything like it. Detailed notes about wind patterns, atmospheric pressure, the behavior of animals before storms, and most remarkably, precise predictions about underground water movements. "She started teaching me when I was 7, Ella said, running her fingers over a page filled with sketches of cloud formations. "Said the women in our family had always been weather-wise, that it was a gift that came with responsibility. Coulter sat beside her on the steps, close enough to study the intricate drawings and neat columns of data. Your grandmother sounds like she was quite a woman. She was everything to me after my parents died. Ella's voice carried the weight of old grief, softened by time, but never fully healed. She took me in without question, taught me to read and cipher, to cook and sew. But most importantly, she taught me to listen. Listen to what? Ella closed her eyes, tilting her face toward the evening breeze. To everything. The way the wind changes before a storm, how the air feels different when rain is coming from hundreds of miles away. She said most people stopped listening to the earth when they grew up, forgot the language they were born knowing. As if to demonstrate, Ella stood and walked to the edge of the porch, her bare feet silent on the wooden boards. She stood perfectly, still for several minutes, her breathing slow and steady, her hands slightly extended as if feeling for something invisible. "There's water moving," she said suddenly. "Not much, and not close to the surface yet, but something's shifting underground, maybe 2 miles northeast of here." Coulter studied her face in the fading light, seeing the absolute certainty in her expression. "You can feel that from here? It's like, imagine you're standing next to a river, but the river is underneath a thick blanket. You can't see it, but you can hear it if you know how to listen. Feel the vibration in your bones." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "My grandmother said the earth is always talking to us. We just forgot how to hear." The implications sent excitement racing through Coulter's chest. If Ella could really predict water movements, if she could sense underground streams and springs before they surfaced, she might be the answer to every rancher's prayers in the drought-stricken territory. "Has it ever been wrong?" he asked. "This sense of yours?" "Sometimes." Ella returned to sit beside him, the journal open to a page filled with her grandmother's notes about failed predictions. Grandmother always said that overconfidence was the enemy of true knowing. She kept track of every mistake, studied them to understand why the reading went wrong. Coulter read over her shoulder, impressed by the systematic approach Sarah Harper had taken to documenting her gift. Each failed prediction included detailed notes about atmospheric conditions, her physical state, and possible factors that might have influenced her judgment. "She taught you to question yourself," he observed, "always. She said that anyone who claimed to be right all the time was either lying or deluding themselves. The earth keeps its own counsel, and sometimes what we think we're feeling is just hope or fear dressed up as knowledge." The honesty in her words impressed Coulter more than boastful certainty would have. This wasn't the performance of a carnival fortune-teller, but the careful methodology of someone who understood the difference between genuine ability and wishful thinking. "Tell me about Dr. Winter," he said. "How did he learn about your gift?" Ella's expression darkened. "I was desperate when he found me in Denver. Grandmother had been dead for 2 months, and I was down to my last few coins. Winter seemed kind at first, offered steady work and protection. I thought I was lucky." "When did that change?" "Almost immediately." She turned a page in the journal, revealing sketches of weather patterns in her own hand. "He wanted me to perform, to make grand predictions for crowds of people. When I tried to explain that it didn't work that way, that I needed time to observe and feel, he got angry. So you started telling people what they wanted to hear instead of what you actually sensed." "Exactly?" A shame in her voice was painful to hear. It was easier than disappointing him, easier than admitting I couldn't perform on command like a trained dog. But every lie I told made me feel more disconnected from the real gift, more like a fraud. Coulter thought about the years she'd spent compromising her integrity, forced to cheapen something sacred for the entertainment of strangers. No wonder she'd been so reluctant to tell him about her abilities. "What about the water you sensed just now?" he asked. "How sure are you?" Ella was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the journal. Grandmother always said to trust the first feeling, before doubt creeps in. When I stood up there, I felt movement. Not strong, not immediate, but real. How long before it might surface? That's harder to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on the underground terrain, the pressure from other sources. A dozen factors I can't see from here. She looked at him directly. "But if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, It's not enough to solve our problems with Winter. She was right, of course. Even if water did surface northeast of the ranch, it wouldn't change the legal reality of Winter's claim or the threat he posed. But it gave Coulter an idea, the beginning of a plan that might turn the tables on the medicine show doctor. What if we could prove your gift to the right people? He asked. Show them that what you do is real, valuable, worth protecting? Who would believe it? And even if they did, Winter has the law on his side. The law, Coulter said slowly, but maybe not the community. There are a dozen ranchers within 30 miles of here, all of them desperate for water. If you could help them find it, prove that you're not just another carnival trick. Ella shook her head. You don't understand? When people are desperate, they want miracles. When you give them knowledge instead of magic, they feel cheated. Winter understood that, used it to his advantage. This is different, Coulter insisted. These are practical men dealing with a practical problem. They don't need miracles. They need water. If you can deliver that, they'll protect you from anyone who tries to take you away. The idea was taking shape in his mind, rough but possible. The territorial ranchers were independent by nature, suspicious of outside authority, especially when it threatened their survival. If Winter tried to reclaim Ella by force, he might find himself facing more opposition than he'd bargained for. It's dangerous, Ella said quietly. If I'm wrong, if the water doesn't come where I predict it will, we'll look like fools. Winter will use that against us. And if you're right? She opened the journal to a page near the back where her grandmother had written in bold letters, "The gift is not for hiding, but for helping. When the earth speaks, we must have the courage to share what we hear." Grandmother always said that knowledge unused was knowledge wasted, Ella admitted. But she also said that some gifts come with a price. The more people who depend on you, the heavier the burden becomes. Coulter understood the weight she was describing. His own family had carried the burden of providing for their community, of being the steady presence others could depend on. It was a responsibility that could crush a person if they let it, but it could also give life meaning beyond mere survival. We don't have to decide tonight, he said. But come morning, I'd like to ride out to that spot you sensed, see what we can learn. Ella nodded, closing the journal with reverent care. There's something else you should know about the contract Winter showed you today. What about it? I never signed anything. Her voice was barely above a whisper. He forged my signature, probably copied it from letters I wrote to potential employers when I was looking for work in Denver. The admission hit Coulter like a physical blow. If Winter had forged the contract, then everything about his legal claim was fraudulent. But proving it would require evidence they didn't have and legal expertise he couldn't afford. Can you prove it? He asked. Maybe. My handwriting has some peculiarities that would be hard to fake perfectly. But who would believe me against a man like Winter? A desperate woman with no money against a respected businessman with official documents? The question hung between them as full darkness settled over the prairie. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. Coulter thought about justice, about the difference between what was legal and what was right, about the courage it took to stand up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves. We'll figure it out, he said finally. One way or another. We'll find a way to fight this. Ella leaned against his shoulder, the first physical contact between them that spoke of trust rather than mere necessity. Why are you doing this? You barely know me. Coulter considered the question, thinking about the loneliness that had echoed through his house for 8 months, about the way Ella's presence had changed something fundamental in his world. But the real answer was simpler than all that. Because it's right, he said. And because some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are against you. Above them, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, distant and cold, but somehow reassuring in their permanence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new decisions that could change everything. But for now, they had each other. They had hope, and they had a plan that might just be crazy enough to work. The marshal's badge caught the morning sunlight, like a cruel star as Frank Hayes rode up to the Hay Bar H at precisely 10 o'clock. Coulter had been expecting him. Winter wasn't the type to make empty threats. And Frank had always been punctual in his dedication to duty, no matter how personal the cost. Ella stood in the kitchen doorway, her face pale but determined. She'd spent the early morning hours poring over her grandmother's journal, looking for anything that might help their cause. Coulter had ridden out before dawn to check the area where she'd sensed water movement, finding nothing yet, but returning with renewed faith in her abilities. The land there felt different somehow, expectant. "Morning, Frank," Coulter called from the porch, his voice carefully neutral. Marshal Frank Hayes, dismounted with the same rigid precision he brought to everything else in life. He was a year younger than Coulter, but looked older, his face lined with the perpetual frown of a man who found little joy in his chosen profession. The badge on his vest was polished to a mirror shine, and his boots showed the meticulous care of someone who believed appearance reflected character. "Coulter." Frank's greeting carried the chill of 15 years' worth of unresolved anger. "I suppose you know why I'm here. Dr. Winter's business, I imagine." "That's right." Frank pulled out the same legal document Winter had shown them the day before, though his handling of it seemed less enthusiastic than the medicine show doctors had been. "This is an official writ of debt collection, properly filed and witnessed. You're harboring a debtor, Coulter. That's against territorial law." "Funny thing about that debt," Coulter said, stepping down from the porch to meet his cousin at eye level. "Seems the lady never actually signed that contract." Frank's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "You have proof of that? Working on it." "Well, until you do, I'm bound by law to enforce this writ." Frank's voice carried the tone of a man reciting an unpleasant duty. "Miss Harper needs to come with me to Pueblo to settle this matter with Dr. Winter. And if she refuses, then I'll have to arrest her for debt evasion." Frank's jaw tightened. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Coulter studied his cousin's face, seeing past the official mask to the uncertainty beneath. Frank had always been a man who followed rules because they provided clear answers in a world full of difficult questions. But even he seemed uncomfortable with Winter's claim. "You've met this Dr. Winter," Coulter said. "What's your impression of him?" "My personal opinions don't matter. The law is the law." "That's not what I asked." Frank was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the drought-stricken landscape. "He's thorough. Came to my office with proper documentation, knew exactly what legal remedies were available. Said he'd dealt with runaway debtors before. Bet he has." Coulter let the implication hang in the air. "How many other young women has he tracked down with convenient contracts they supposedly signed? That's not for me to judge, isn't it?" Coulter took a step closer. "You're wearing a badge, Frank. That's supposed to mean something more than just following orders." Frank's facade cracked slightly. "Don't lecture me about duty, Coulter. You had your chance to serve the law, and you chose cows over justice. There it was, the old wound that had never properly healed. 15 years ago, they'd both been courting Mary Sullivan, a school teacher from Denver with laughing eyes and a smile that could make a man forget his own name. When she'd chosen Coulter over Frank, it had shattered more than just romantic dreams. It had broken the friendship between two boys who'd been raised like brothers. "Mary's been gone a long time, Frank," Coulter said quietly. "This isn't about her. Everything's about her." Frank's voice carried a bitterness that time hadn't softened. "She chose you, and 3 months later, she was dead of consumption. If she'd chosen me, she'd have lived in town, had access to doctors. You don't know that. I know she'd have had a better chance than she did out here in the middle of nowhere, playing house with a rancher who thought love was enough to keep her alive." The accusation hit harder than any physical blow. Coulter had lived with the same guilt for 15 years, wondering if his love had killed the woman he'd planned to marry. The what-ifs had tormented him through countless sleepless nights, driving him deeper into isolation and self-recrimination. From the kitchen doorway came the soft sound of Ella's indrawn breath. She'd heard every word, understood the pain that lay beneath this family feud. "This isn't about Mary," Coulter repeated, his voice steadier than he felt. "This is about a man who preys on desperate women and uses the law to cover his crimes." "Alleged crimes," Frank corrected automatically. "And even if they're true, I can't ignore a legal writ just because I don't like the man who filed it. What if the writ is fraudulent? Frank looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean, what if Dr. Winter forged that signature? What if the whole contract is a lie designed to give legal cover to kidnapping? That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Coulter pulled out the document Frank had handed him, pointing to the signature line. Look at this writing. Does it look like the hand of an educated woman to you? Frank studied the signature with the careful attention of a man trained to notice details. His frown deepened as he examined the shaky letters, the inconsistent spacing. That suggested someone copying unfamiliar penmanship. It's irregular, he admitted reluctantly. Ella, Coulter called. Would you come out here for a moment? Ella emerged from the kitchen with obvious reluctance, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked fragile in the morning light, but there was steel in her spine that even fear couldn't bend. Miss Harper, Frank said formally, touching his hat brim. I'm Marshal Hayes, Marshal. Her voice was steady despite the circumstances. I need to ask you about this contract. Frank held up the document. Did you sign this agreement with Dr. Winter? No, sir. I never signed anything. Dr. Winter said contracts were for people who didn't trust each other, that a handshake was enough for honest folks. Frank looked from the signature to Ella's face, his trained eye noting the differences between the confident way she spoke and the hesitant scrawl on the document. Can you write your name for me? He asked. Of course. Ella accepted the pencil. And paper Frank offered, writing her signature with the fluid confidence of someone comfortable with a pen. The difference between her natural handwriting and the forged signature was immediately apparent. Frank stared at the two samples for a long moment, his expression growing darker. This isn't the same hand, he said finally. No, sir, it's not. Why? Didn't you mention this yesterday when Dr. Winter showed me the original document? Ella glanced at Coulter before answering. Would you have believed me? A desperate woman with no money against a respected businessman with official papers? Frank's silence was answer enough. In his world of black and white justice, the word of a well-dressed man with proper documentation carried more weight than the protestations of someone society deemed disposable. This changes things, Frank said slowly. Does it? Coulter pressed. Or are you still bound by law to enforce a fraudulent writ? Frank studied the two signatures again, his certainty crumbling. I'll need to investigate further. Compare the handwriting. Samples, maybe get an expert opinion, while Dr. Winter disappears with Ella. Coulter interrupted. How long do you think he'll wait around once he realizes you're questioning his story? The marshal's badge seemed to weigh heavier on Frank's chest. He'd built his identity around upholding the law, but what happened when the law itself was corrupted by lies? I can't ignore the writ entirely, he said finally, but I can delay enforcement pending investigation. How long? A few days, maybe a week if I can justify it. It wasn't much, but it was more time than they'd had an hour ago. Coulter felt a grudging respect for his cousin's willingness to bend his rigid principles when faced with clear evidence of wrongdoing. Thank you, Ella said quietly. Frank nodded curtly, clearly uncomfortable with gratitude for doing what should have been obvious duty. Don't thank me yet. If I can't prove fraud, I'll still have to enforce the writ. We understand. Frank remounted his horse, settling into the saddle with the weary grace of a man who spent more time traveling than at home. Coulter, he said, for what it's worth, I never blamed you for Mary's choice. I blamed you for what happened after. No, maybe I was wrong about that too. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was closer to reconciliation than they'd come in 15 years. Frank rode away without looking back, leaving Coulter and Ella standing in the yard with a few precious days of freedom and a mountain of problems still to solve. He's not what I expected, Ella said. Frank's a good man trapped in a bad situation, Coulter replied. He'll do the right thing if he can find a way to justify it legally. And if he can't? Coulter watched his cousin's figure disappear over the eastern ridge. Then we'd better have a backup plan. That afternoon, they rode out to check the area where Ella had sensed water movement. The land looked no different than any other patch of drought-stricken prairie, but Ella spent an hour walking the ground with her eyes closed. feeling for subtle changes in pressure and moisture. It's stronger today, she announced finally. Whatever's moving down there, it's getting closer to the surface. How much closer? Hard to say exactly. But I think we might see seepage within a few days. Maybe sooner if there's pressure from other sources. If she was right, if water really did surface where she'd predicted, it would go a long way toward proving her abilities to the skeptical ranchers of the territory. But it would also make her more valuable to Dr. Winter, more worth pursuing despite the legal complications. As they rode back toward the ranch, Coulter found himself thinking about Mary Sullivan, about the choices that had shaped his life and the guilt that had driven him into solitude. Maybe Frank had been right. Maybe loving someone meant protecting them from danger, even if that protection felt like abandonment. But looking at Ella, seeing the determination in her green eyes, and the way she'd stood up to Frank despite her fear, Coulter realized that some people couldn't be protected by keeping them safe. Some people needed the chance to fight for themselves, to prove their worth on their own terms. The question was whether he had the courage to let her try. Ledger lay open on the kitchen table like an accusation, its columns of red ink telling the story of 3 years of declining fortunes. Coulter had avoided looking at the numbers for weeks, but Dr. Winter's threats had forced him to confront the brutal mathematics of his situation. The Hay-Bar H owed $847 in back taxes money he simply didn't have and couldn't raise through normal means. Ella sat across from him, her grandmother's weather journal open beside the ledger like a counterpoint to despair. She'd been documenting new observations about the underground water movement, sketching pressure patterns and atmospheric changes with the methodical precision her grandmother had taught her. It's not as bad as it looks, she said, though they both knew she was trying to comfort him rather than stating fact. $847, Coulter repeated, running his finger down the column of debts. That's more money than most folks see in 5 years. What happens if you can't pay? The territory seizes the ranch for unpaid taxes, sells it at auction to the highest bidder. He closed the ledger with a snap that sounded like a coffin lid. Frank gets to oversee the whole process, make sure everything's legal and proper. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. While Frank investigated Dr. Winter's fraudulent contract, he would also be preparing to destroy Coulter's life through perfectly legitimate means. How long do you have? Tax sale is scheduled for the end of the month, 3 weeks from today. Ella was quiet for a moment, her pen tracing idle patterns on the margin of her journal. What about the cattle? Couldn't you sell them? 50 head. OF half-starved beef in a drought year? Coulter shook his head. I'd be lucky to get $10 a head, and that's if I could find buyers with cash instead of credit. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. Even if he sold every animal on the ranch, he'd barely raise half of what he owed. The drought had destroyed not just his herd, but the entire regional cattle market. A knock at the front door interrupted his brooding. Through the window, he could see 2 riders approaching neighbors from the look of them, though he couldn't immediately identify who they were. Stay here, he told Ella, rising to answer the door. On the porch stood Tom Morrison and Jake Wheeler, both ranchers from spreads 15 miles south. Tom was a weathered man in his 60s who'd been fighting the Colorado Territory's harsh realities since before statehood. Jake was younger, maybe 40, with the desperate look of someone watching his dreams crumble one dry day at a time. Coulter, Tom said, touching his hat brim. Hope you don't mind us dropping by unannounced. Not at all. Come in, have some coffee. The 3 men settled around the kitchen table while Ella poured coffee from the pot that seemed to stay warm. From dawn to dusk, she moved quietly, but Coulter noticed both visitors watching her with curious interest. This is Miss Ella Harper, Coulter said. She's staying here while she recovers from some troubles. Tom nodded politely, but Jake's attention lingered on Ella's face. You wouldn't be the lady that medicine show doctor's been asking about, would you? The question sent a chill through the kitchen. What medicine show doctor? Coulter asked, though he already knew the answer. Fellow named Winter came by my place yesterday, Jake said, asking if anyone had seen a young woman matching her description. Said she was dangerous, had stolen money from him. What did you tell him? Told him I hadn't seen hide nor hair of anyone like that. Jake's eyes moved between Coulter and Ella. But I got to thinking afterward, seemed odd for a man to be hunting one woman so hard. Made me wonder what the real story was. Tom leaned forward, his lined face serious. Winter came to my spread too. Offered a $50 reward for information about this lady. That's more money than most folks around here see in months. $50. The amount hit Coulter like a physical blow. Winter was serious about getting Ella back, serious enough to put real money behind his search. Worse, he was spreading his story throughout the territory, poisoning opinion against her before she had a chance to prove herself. The real story, Ella said quietly, is that Dr. Winter held me in debt slavery for 3 years, abandoned me to die beside a broken wagon, and is now using forged documents to try to reclaim me. Both visitors studied her face, weighing her words against Winter's accusations. Tom's expression remained neutral, but Jake looked troubled. That's a serious charge, Tom said finally. It's a serious situation, Coulter replied. Frank Hayes is investigating the forgery claim, but Winter's not waiting around for legal niceties. Jake shifted in his chair. There's something else you should know. Winter's not working alone anymore. Word is he's hired some men from Pueblo, tough types with questionable reputations. How many men? 4 or 5, according to what I heard in town. They're asking questions, watching the roads, making it clear they're not planning to leave empty-handed. The kitchen fell silent, except for the tick of the mantel clock. Winter was escalating the situation, transforming a legal dispute into something approaching a small war. With hired guns backing him up, he could take Ella by force, if necessary, and worry about legal justification later. There's more, Tom said reluctantly. Winter's been talking to some of the other ranchers, telling them you're harboring a dangerous criminal. Some folks are starting to believe him. Coulter felt anger building in his chest. Winter wasn't just threatening Ella. He was systematically destroying her reputation throughout the territory, making it impossible for her to find allies or sanctuary anywhere else. What do you believe? He asked directly. Tom and Jake exchanged glances before Tom answered. We've known you for 15 years, Coulter. You're not the type to shelter criminals or make poor judgments about character. If you say this lady's been wronged, that's good enough for us. The simple declaration of trust meant more than Coulter could express. In a world where reputation mattered more than money, having respected neighbors vouch for your judgment was invaluable. I appreciate that, he said, more than you know. The question is, Jake said, what are we going to do about it? Winter's got the law on his side, at least officially, and those hired guns give him teeth to back up his claims. Ella looked up from her coffee cup. There might be a way to prove I'm not the criminal Winter claims I am. All 3 men turned to her expectantly. My grandmother taught me to read weather patterns, to predict where water will surface during droughts. She gestured toward her open journal. I've been sensing movement in the underground streams northeast of here. If I'm right, water should start seeping to the surface within days. Tom's eyebrows rose. You're talking about water divining? Not divining exactly. More like reading the signs that are already there. Pressure changes animal behavior, the way the ground feels under your feet. Jake leaned forward with sudden interest. My grandfather used to talk about such things. Said some folks could feel water in their bones. Could you find water on our spreads? Tom asked. Ella glanced at Coulter before answering. I could try, but I need to be honest, it's not magic. I can sense where water might surface, but I can't make it appear where it doesn't exist. That's more than any of us have right now, Jake said. My wells have been dry for 6 months. Lost half my herd already. Tom nodded grimly. Same here. If you could find even a small spring, it might save what's left of our operations. Coulter saw the hope kindling in their eyes and felt both excitement and trepidation. If Ella could help these desperate men find water, it would prove her value to the community and potentially create a powerful alliance against Winter's threats. But if she was wrong, if her predictions failed, it would destroy her credibility and leave her more vulnerable than ever. There's risk involved, he said carefully. If this doesn't work out, Everything's a risk these days, Tom interrupted. The question is whether we're willing to try something different, or just sit here waiting to die of thirst. Jake stood up, decision made. I say we give the lady a chance to prove herself. What's the worst that could happen? We waste a day or two digging where she tells us to dig? The worst that could happen, Coulter said, is that Winter uses any failure as evidence that Ella's nothing but a fraud. That could give him the ammunition he needs to turn the whole territory against her. And if she succeeds? Tom asked. Then we'll have the strongest argument possible for protecting her. Men who depend on someone for their survival tend to be very loyal. The three ranchers looked at Ella, who sat quietly absorbing the weight of their expectations. Her grandmother's journal lay open beside her coffee cup, its pages filled with decades of accumulated wisdom about reading the Earth's hidden language. I'm willing to try, she said finally, but I need everyone to understand that this isn't a performance or a guarantee. It's just knowledge, the kind of knowledge that comes from paying attention to things most people ignore. Tom extended his weathered hand across the table. That's all we're asking for, miss. A chance. Ella shook his hand, then Jake's, sealing an agreement that could change everything or destroy them all. Outside, the afternoon sun beat down on the drought-stricken prairie with relentless intensity. But inside the kitchen of the Hay Marach, hope flickered like a candle flame in the darkness. The battle for Ella Harper's freedom was about to become a test of her extraordinary gift. The cattle brand template lay spread across Tom Morrison's kitchen table like a battle plan. Its design, simple but powerful, interlocking circles, representing the unity of desperate ranchers, willing to stake everything on one extraordinary gamble. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across a landscape that hadn't seen meaningful rain in 8 months. Ella stood at the window, her eyes closed and her breathing steady as she felt for the subtle atmospheric changes that might signal underground water movement. Behind her, 6 ranchers studied maps and discussed logistics with the intensity of generals planning a campaign. If Miss Harper is right about the water locations, Tom said, pointing to marks Ella had made on a hand-drawn map, we could run cattle from all our spreads to these gathering points. Jake Wheeler nodded, his weathered face alive with possibility. For the first time in months. Create temporary watering stations, and move the herds together for one massive drive to market. The railroad's paying top dollar for beef in Denver, added Ben Carmichael, a lean man whose spread bordered the mountains. Problem's always been getting the cattle there alive. Coulter studied the brand template, its design speaking to something deeper than mere business partnership. The interlocking circles suggested permanence, community, the kind of mutual dependence that could survive drought and hardship. This isn't just about one cattle drive, he said slowly. You're talking about changing how we do business permanently. Exactly. Tom's voice carried the conviction of a man who'd found hope after months of despair. Individually, we're all dying slow deaths. Together, we might actually survive this drought. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the window, Coulter could see 3 riders approaching at a leisurely pace too. Relaxed to be bringing urgent news, too purposeful to be casual visitors. That's Marshal Hayes, Jake observed. And 2 men I don't recognize. Ella's eyes snapped open, her weather sense forgotten in the face of more immediate danger. It's Dr. Winter, she said quietly. He's with them. The kitchen fell silent as the implications sank in. Winter had somehow convinced Frank to bring him directly to their meeting, either through legal pressure or simple deception. Either way, it meant their plans would be exposed before they'd had a chance to prove Ella's abilities. Stay calm, Coulter said, though his own heart was racing. Let me handle this. The 6 men stepped out onto Tom's porch as the riders approached. Frank looked uncomfortable, his jaw tight with the strain of balancing duty against personal conviction. Dr. Winter rode beside him with the satisfied air of a man closing a successful negotiation, while the 3rd rider, one of Winter's hired guns, by the look of him surveyed the gathering with cold professional interest. Afternoon, gentlemen? Frank called as they reined up. Sorry to interrupt your meeting. Marshal, Tom replied formally. What brings you out this way? Frank dismounted, his movements stiff with reluctance. Dr. Winter has some questions about Miss Harper's whereabouts. He has reason to believe she might be in this area." Winter stepped down from his horse with theatrical grace, removing his hat to reveal silver hair that caught the afternoon light. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your cooperation in this matter. I'm simply trying to recover stolen property and bring a dangerous fugitive to justice." The words hit the gathered ranchers like a slap. Ben Carmichael's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, while Jake's face darkened with anger. "That's a serious accusation," Tom said carefully. "It's a serious situation," Winter replied, echoing words Coulter had used himself. "Miss Harper owes me a considerable debt and has fled my lawful custody. I have every right to reclaim her." "Where is she now?" Frank asked, his tone suggesting he hoped the answer would be anywhere but here. Coulter stepped forward, drawing attention away from the house, where Ella waited with growing fear. "She's under my protection, Frank. You know that." "Your protection isn't recognized by territorial law," Winter said smoothly. "The marshal has explained the legal situation quite clearly." Frank's expression suggested he'd explained more than he'd wanted to, probably under pressure from Winter's superior legal maneuvering. The medicine show doctor had clearly done his homework about territorial law and jurisdictional authority. "The lady claims your contract is forged," Tom said bluntly. Winter's smile never wavered. Naturally, she would claim that. Desperate people often resort to desperate lies when faced with their legal obligations. "What if she could prove her claims?" Ben asked. "How could she possibly do that? Her word against properly witnessed documents." Winter spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable certainty. "I'm afraid the law requires more substantial evidence than the protestations of a known thief." The casual dismissal of Ella's character sent anger rippling through the group of ranchers. These were men who'd spent their lives building reputations, based on handshake agreements and personal integrity. Winter's assumption that documentation trumped character struck at the heart of their value system. "Maybe we should hear what the lady has to say," Jake suggested. "I'm afraid that's not necessary," Winter replied. "The marshal has his duty to perform, and I have my property to reclaim." The word property hung in the air like a curse. "Even." Frank visibly flinched at Winter's casual dehumanization of Ella, though his badge bound him to enforce the law, regardless of his personal feelings. "There is one thing," Coulter said slowly. "Miss Harper has certain abilities that might interest you gentlemen." Winter's eyes sharpened with predatory interest. "What sort of abilities?" "She can predict where water will surface during droughts. Read weather patterns in ways most folks can't understand." The ranchers around him nodded, though Winter's expression suggested skepticism mixed with greed. If Ella really could find water, she would be far more valuable than even he had realized. "Interesting," Winter said, "though hardly relevant to the legal matter at hand." "Could be very relevant," Tom interjected. "If the lady could prove her abilities to our satisfaction, we might be inclined to take a more protective interest in her welfare." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. 6 armed ranchers united in common cause represented more firepower than Winter's small band of hired guns could handle. Even with the law technically on his side, he would face serious practical difficulties. If the local community decided to oppose him, Frank looked from Winter to the gathered ranchers, clearly recognizing the dangerous undercurrents in the conversation. "This isn't the way to handle things," he said. "Let's all stay calm and work within the law." "The law," Ben said coldly, "that lets snake oil salesmen forge contracts and claim ownership of human beings?" "That's not proven," Frank replied, though. His voice lacked conviction. "Then let's prove it," Coulter said. "Give us 3 days to test Miss Harper's abilities. If she can find water where she claims, if she can demonstrate skills that make her valuable to this community, then maybe we can discuss alternative solutions to Dr. Winter's debt claim." Winter's mask of reasonable civility began to slip. "I'm not interested in demonstrations or negotiations. I want my property returned immediately." "She's not property," Jake said flatly. "She's a person with rights." "She's a debtor with legal obligations," Winter shot back. "And I've been more than patient in pursuing those obligations through proper channels." The hired gunman behind Winter shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his weapon. The movement didn't go unnoticed by the ranchers, who spread out. Slightly to present less concentrated targets, Frank stepped between the two groups, his badge suddenly feeling more like a target than a symbol of authority. Everyone needs to calm down. This isn't going to be settled by gunplay. And how is it going to be settled? Tom asked. Frank looked at Winter, then at the ranchers, clearly weighing his options. 3 days, he said finally. I'll give you 3 days to investigate the forgery claims and test any other relevant factors. After that, I enforce the writ as written. Winter's face flushed with anger. That's not what we agreed, Marshal. It's what I'm deciding, Frank replied with more backbone than Coulter had seen from his cousin in years. 3 days is reasonable for a proper investigation. And if the lady fails to prove her abilities? Winter asked. Then she comes with you willingly, and we don't interfere. Tom said. It was a dangerous gamble, staking everything on Ella's untested gift. But it was also their only chance to create a legal framework for protecting her that even Frank couldn't ignore. Winter remounted his horse with obvious displeasure. 3 days, then, but I'll be watching, gentlemen. Any attempt to help her flee will be considered obstruction of justice. As the 3 riders departed, the ranchers stood in silence, absorbing the weight of the commitment they'd just made. In 3 days, Ella would either prove herself the miracle they desperately needed, or she would be lost to Winter's cruel ambitions forever. Well, Tom said finally, I guess we better hope the lady knows what she's talking about. Coulter thought about Ella waiting inside the house, about the courage it would take to stake her freedom on abilities she'd spent 3 years doubting. She does, he said. Question is whether we're brave enough to trust her. The brand template still lay on the kitchen table, its interlocking circles suddenly seeming less like a business plan and more like a prayer for salvation. In 3 days, they would learn whether hope was enough to overcome the harsh mathematics of drought, debt, and desperation. The hidden survey map lay buried beneath 20 years of accumulated papers in the Territorial Land Office. It's yellowed, edges and faded ink holding secrets that could reshape the entire Colorado Territory. Marshal Frank Hayes had been searching through dusty filing cabinets for 2 days, looking for anything that might support or disprove Dr. Winter's claims, when his fingers found the misfiled document that changed everything. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, spreading the survey map across the cluttered desk. The document bore the official seal of the U.S. Geological Survey and was dated 1887, 4 years before the current crisis. What it revealed made Frank's blood run cold. The map showed extensive underground water, systems beneath the very lands that Dr. Winter had been systematically targeting. Not just the Hay Bar H, but Tom Morrison's spread, Jake Wheeler's ranch, and half a dozen other properties in the region. According to the survey, these lands sat atop one of the largest underground aquifers in the territory, water source that could support thousands of cattle and hundreds of families for generations. Frank studied the notations carefully, his legal training helping him understand the implications. Someone with access to this survey would know exactly which properties would become invaluable once the drought ended, and then underground water sources inevitably surfaced. Someone could position themselves to acquire drought-stricken lands for pennies on the dollar, then sell them for fortunes when their true value became apparent. Someone like Dr. Silas Winter, who seemed to know far more about territorial law and land acquisition than any traveling medicine show doctor should. Frank reached for his coat. The survey map rolled carefully in his hand. This information needed to reach Coulter immediately, but first he had one more stop to make. The telegraph office would have records of any messages sent to or from Winter during his stay in Pueblo. 30 minutes later, Frank stared at a telegraph log that confirmed his worst suspicions. Over the past month, Dr. Winter had sent and received numerous coded messages to Denver business interests discussing property acquisition opportunities and water rights speculation. The messages referenced specific ranch properties by name, including the Hay Bar H, and discussed timetables for debt collection activities that corresponded exactly with Winter's pursuit of Ella. But the most damning evidence was a message from 3 days ago. Package secured. Proceed with acquisition phase. Expect resistance from local marshal. The reply had been equally telling. Marshal's cooperation purchased. Complete transaction before geological survey becomes public knowledge. Frank felt sick as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Winter wasn't just a traveling charlatan. He was the front man for a sophisticated land grab scheme that depended on keeping local landowners ignorant of their property's true value. Ella Harper wasn't valuable to him because of any debt. She was valuable because her weather sensing abilities could expose the underground water sources that made the scheme possible, and Frank himself had been bought not with money, but with Winter's promise to help him finally settle his old grudge against Coulter. The medicine show doctor had played on 15 years of buried resentment, manipulating Frank's emotions to secure his cooperation in what amounted to massive fraud. The realization of his own complicity hit Frank like a physical blow. His badge, his oath, his entire sense of professional identity, all of it had been corrupted by his personal hatred for a cousin who'd done nothing wrong except win the love of a woman who died too young. Frank mounted his horse and rode hard for the Haybar H, the survey map and telegraph evidence secured in his saddlebags. Behind him, storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, the first meaningful weather change the territory had seen in months. At the ranch, he found Coulter and Ella standing in the northeast pasture where she predicted water would surface. Around them, 6 ranchers watched with growing excitement as a small spring bubbled up through the drought-cracked earth, exactly where Ella had said it would appear. "Frank," Coulter called as his cousin approached. "You're just in time to see. We need to talk," Frank interrupted, dismounting with grim urgency. "All of you. What I'm about to show you changes everything." The group gathered around as Frank spread the survey map on the ground, weighing down its corners with rocks. The afternoon sun illuminated the faded lines and notations that told the story of vast underground wealth. "This is a geological survey from 1887, Frank explained. "It shows underground water systems throughout this entire region. According to this document, you're all sitting on fortunes." Tom Morrison knelt beside the map, tracing the blue lines that indicated underground streams. "These markings, they show water under all our properties? Not just water. According to the survey notes, this is one of the largest underground aquifer systems in the Colorado Territory. The drought has been hiding it, but the water's there enough to support massive cattle operations and farming communities." Ella studied the map with growing comprehension. "That's why Dr. Winter was so interested in my abilities. Not because I owed him money, but because I could expose the water sources before he finished buying up the land." "Exactly." Frank pulled out the telegraph messages, his voice heavy with shame. "Winter's part of a Denver investment group that's been systematically acquiring drought-stricken properties at bankruptcy prices. They've been using the territorial government to pressure landowners into selling and planning to develop the water resources once they own everything." Jake Wheeler's face darkened with anger. "You mean this whole drought crisis could have been avoided if people knew about the underground water?" "Not avoided, but managed much better. If ranchers had known where to dig, they could have found water to keep their herds alive." Frank met Coulter's eyes directly. "Your ranch sits right on top of one of the main aquifer junctions. That's why Winter was so determined to get Ella back, and why he was willing to use forged documents to do it." The implications rippled through the group like wildfire. Every desperate decision, every ranch sold for pennies, every family driven away by hardship, all of it had been orchestrated by men who possessed information they deliberately kept secret. "What about the tax debts?" Coulter asked. "The forced sales?" Frank's expression grew even grimmer. "I suspect those were manipulated too. Winter's group has been buying up tax liens, then accelerating the collection process to force quick sales. They probably own your debt, Coulter." The pieces of the conspiracy fell into place with sickening clarity. Winter hadn't just been hunting one runaway fortune teller. He'd been orchestrating the systematic theft of an entire region's wealth, using legal mechanisms to disguise outright fraud. "What can we do about it?" Ben Carmichael asked. "Legally? Not much, at least not quickly." Frank rolled up the survey map with careful hands. "This kind of fraud investigation could take months, and Winter's group will disappear long before we can build a case." "Then we don't handle it legally," Tom said flatly. I can't be part of anything outside the law, Frank warned. You won't have to be. Coulter's voice carried a cold determination that his cousin hadn't heard since they were boys. But you can give us time to handle it our way. Frank looked at the faces around him, honest men driven to desperation by forces they'd never understood, now learning they'd been betrayed by the very systems meant to protect them. His badge felt heavier than ever, weighted with the knowledge of his own complicity in their suffering. What do you need? He asked. 24 hours, Coulter said. Can you delay Winter that long? I can try. But he's got his own hired guns. And they're not bound by legal niceties. Neither are we, if it comes to that. The storm clouds on the horizon had grown darker, and Ella stood with her face turned toward the changing wind. There's a big weather system moving in, she announced. Not just rain, this feels like the kind of storm that breaks droughts. As if summoned by her words, the first drops of rain began to fall, striking the dusty ground with the sound of hope being born. The little spring that had appeared where Ella predicted bubbled more strongly, as if responding to the atmospheric pressure changes she could feel in her bones. If we're going to act, Tom said, it has to be tonight. Once that storm hits, travel will be impossible for days. Coulter looked at Ella, seeing determination in her green eyes that matched his own. Are you ready for this? I've been ready for 3 years, she replied. Time to show Dr. Winter what happens when he tries to own something that was never his. To claim. The rain began to fall harder, washing the dust from the air and filling the drought-stricken land with the promise of renewal. But first, there would be a reckoning for the men who tried to steal hope itself and sell it back at a profit. The final battle for the soul of the Colorado Territory was about to begin. Coulter's father's spurs caught the lamplight as he strapped them on in the pre-dawn darkness, their silver rowels worn smooth by 30 years of honest work. The metal felt cold against his hands, heavy with the weight of family tradition and the courage he would need for what lay ahead. Outside, the storm that Ella had predicted was building strength, turning the October air sharp with the promise of the first real rain the territory had seen in 8 months. You don't have to wear those, Ella said quietly from where she sat on the edge of the bed, watching him prepare for what could be their last morning together. My father wore them during the worst blizzard of '73 when he lost half his herd, but saved the other half through sheer stubbornness. Coulter tested the buckles, feeling the familiar weight settle against his boot heels. He always said they reminded him that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Ella nodded, understanding the ritual even if she didn't share its history. Her own preparations were more practical sturdy boots, a warm coat, and gongs. Her grandmother's weather journal wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the coming storm. But most importantly, she carried the confidence that came from finally understanding her own worth. The cattle drive will have to start before full dark, she said, studying the atmospheric pressure readings she'd been taking since midnight. This storm is going to be bigger than anything the territory's seen in years. If we wait too long, we'll lose control of the herd. How much time do we have? 6 hours, maybe 7. But the wind's already shifting, and I can feel the pressure dropping fast. From the kitchen came the sounds of Tom Morrison and Jake Wheeler, preparing the massive breakfast that would fuel 20 men through the most dangerous night of their lives. Word had spread quickly through the ranching community, and by midnight, volunteers had been arriving from spreads as far as 50 miles away. Not all of them understood the full scope of Winter's conspiracy, but they all understood what it meant when neighbors called for help. Ben Carmichael appeared in the doorway, his face grim with the weight of command. As the most experienced trail boss among them, he'd been elected to coordinate the massive cattle drive that would either save them all or destroy them completely. Riders are positioned at all the gathering points, he reported. We've got close to 400 head assembled, which is more than we hoped for, but also more than we can safely control in a storm. What about Winter's men? Coulter asked. Frank's keeping them busy with legal paperwork, but they won't stay distracted forever. Word is they've got rifles and aren't afraid to use them. The plan they'd hatched during the long night was ambitious, to the point of madness. Using Ella's weather predictions and the hidden survey map, They would drive cattle from 6 different ranches to the underground water sources that were already beginning to surface under atmospheric pressure changes. The combined herd would then be sold to buyers Frank had secretly contacted in Denver, with the proceeds used to pay off Winter's fraudulent debts and prove the true value of the land. But success depended on precise timing, perfect weather prediction, and the cooperation of several hundred cattle who had no interest in human schemes for justice. There's something else, Ben continued reluctantly. Marshal Hayes sent word that Winter's threatening to call in federal marshals if we interfere with his debt collection. Claims were part of a criminal conspiracy to harbor a fugitive. Coulter felt cold anger settle in his chest. Winter was escalating again, using every legal weapon at his disposal to maintain his grip on stolen wealth. What did Frank tell him? That federal jurisdiction doesn't apply to territorial debt collection matters. But if Winter can make the charges stick, we could all end up in federal prison. The stakes kept rising, transforming a simple rescue mission into something approaching open rebellion against corrupt authority. Coulter thought about his parents, about the legacy they'd built through honest work and community service, and wondered if they would approve of what he was planning. Any regrets? He asked Ella. About what? About getting involved with a stubborn rancher who doesn't know when to quit. Ella's smile carried the warmth of genuine affection. My grandmother always said that some gifts come with obligations. Maybe you're part of mine. From outside came the sound of horses and men, the controlled chaos of a major operation beginning to take shape. Through the window, Coulter could see riders moving cattle into position, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the pre-dawn darkness. Tom Morrison appeared in the kitchen doorway, his weathered face alive with nervous energy. Time to go, folks. The herds assembled and ready to move. Coulter stood, settling his hat and checking his gun one final time. Beside him, Ella gathered her journal and the small bag that contained everything she owned in the world. In 6 hours, they would either be free or dead, with very little middle ground between those outcomes. One last thing, Ben said as they prepared to leave. If this goes bad, if Winter's men start shooting, everyone's under orders to protect. Miss Harper first. This whole operation depends on her making it through alive. I can take care of myself, Ella protested. Maybe so. But you're the only one who can read the weather signs. That'll keep us from driving 400 head of cattle over a cliff in the dark. The truth of that statement sobered everyone. Ella's gift wasn't just valuable, it was irreplaceable. Without her ability to sense atmospheric changes and predict water movements, they would be blind men stumbling through a storm, with hundreds of lives depending on their guidance. They stepped out into the pre-dawn air, where 20 men waited, beside saddled horses and loaded supply wagons. The assembled riders represented every major ranch in the territory, brought together by shared desperation and common cause. Coulter recognized most of them neighbors he'd known for years, men who'd shared struggles and celebrations, births and funerals, the entire cycle of frontier life. Gentlemen, he called, his voice carrying across the assembled group. You all know why we're here. Dr. Winter and his associates have been systematically stealing our land through fraud and corruption. Tonight, we prove that our ranches are worth fighting for. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. These were men who'd built their lives on the principle that honest work deserved honest reward. That community meant protecting each other against those who would prey on the weak. Miss Harper will guide us to water sources that can sustain our herds through the worst drought any of us have seen. Coulter continued. If we succeed, we save not just our individual spreads, but the entire ranching community. If we fail, we won't fail, Tom Morrison called out, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who'd survived 30 years of frontier hardship. We've got right on our side, and that counts for something. Jake Wheeler raised his rifle toward the storm dark sky. And if right's not enough, we've got these to even the odds. The assembled riders cheered, though Coulter could see the fear beneath their bravado. They were facing trained killers with nothing but determination and the desperate hope that justice would somehow prevail against superior firepower. Ella stepped forward, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. The storm will be on us by full dark, But that's also our advantage. Winter's men won't be able to track us in heavy rain, and the cattle will be easier to control if they're seeking shelter from the wind. She pulled out her grandmother's journal, its pages fluttering in the rising breeze. I've mapped 3 main water sources along our route. The first should surface about 2 hours after we start moving, the second just after midnight, and the third, if my readings are correct, will be the largest spring any of us have ever seen. Ben Carmichael studied the route she'd sketched on his map. That's a lot of ground to cover in one night, especially with this much livestock. It's also our only chance, Ella replied. Winter's expecting us to hide, to run, to do anything, except take the offensive. He won't be prepared for a massive cattle drive in the middle of a storm. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain from the western mountains. Coulter felt his father's spurs settle against his boot heels as he mounted his horse, the familiar weight a reminder of all the men who'd worked this land before him. "Mount up," he called to the assembled riders. "Time to show these city folks what Colorado Territory ranchers are made of." The procession that left the Hay Bar H in the gray pre-dawn light was unlike anything the Territory had ever seen. 20 riders spread across a quarter-mile front, guiding nearly 400 head of cattle toward an uncertain destiny. Behind them, supply wagons carried food, water, and ammunition for what could become either the shortest or longest night of their lives. Ella rode beside Coulter at the front of the column, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of atmospheric change. Every few minutes she would stop, dismount, and press her hands against the earth, reading pressure shifts and underground movements with the inherited wisdom of generations. "First water source is about a mile ahead," she announced as they crested. "A low ridge. I can feel it getting stronger." Sure enough, when they reached the predicted location, a small spring had begun to bubble up through the drought-cracked earth. The cattle smelled the water immediately, their pace quickening despite the drovers' efforts to maintain order. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered one of the riders from a neighboring ranch. "She really can do it." Word of the successful prediction spread quickly through the column, transforming skepticism into something approaching awe. Men who'd spent months watching their wells run dry were seeing water appear exactly where a slip of a girl had said it would be. But their celebration was short-lived. From the eastern ridge came the sound of approaching horses. Too many horses, moving too fast to be friendly. "Winter's men," Ben called out, shading his eyes against the pale morning sun. "Looks like 6 or 7 riders, armed and moving to intercept." Coulter felt his blood quicken as he recognized the lead rider's silver hair. Dr. Winter himself was leading the pursuit, apparently tired of waiting for legal solutions to his illegal problems. "How long until they reach us?" Ella asked. 20 minutes, maybe less." She closed her eyes, feeling for atmospheric changes with desperate concentration. "The pressure's dropping faster than I expected. This storm is going to hit hard and soon." "Can we outrun them?" "Not with 400 head of cattle," Ben said grimly. "We're committed now forward or nothing." Coulter looked at the faces around him, seeing fear mixed with determination in equal measure. These men had risked everything on the word of a woman they barely knew, trusting her gift and his judgment against overwhelming odds. "All right, listen up," he called to the scattered riders. "We knew this might happen. Everyone stick to the plan, protect the herd, protect Miss Harper, and keep moving toward the water sources no matter what." "What about Winter's men?" Jake asked. "Leave them to me." The words surprised Coulter even as he spoke them. He wasn't a violent man by nature, had built his life around creation rather than destruction. But something about Winter's casual cruelty, his assumption that people could be owned and discarded like property, had awakened a cold fury that demanded satisfaction. Ella touched his arm. "Don't do anything stupid because of me." "I'm not doing this because of you," he replied. "I'm doing it because it's right." The approaching riders were close enough now to make out individual faces. Winter rode with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way through intimidation and legal manipulation. Behind him, his hired guns spread out in a skirmish line, their rifles ready for immediate use. "Mr. Hayes," Winter called across the narrowing distance, "I'm afraid you're interfering with legal debt collection." I must insist you surrender, miss. Harper, immediately. I'm afraid I can't do that, Dr. Winter, Coulter replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. Seems your legal documents are somewhat questionable. Questionable or not, they're signed by a territorial marshal. That makes them binding until proven otherwise in a court of law. Funny thing about courts, Tom Morrison called out. They tend to frown on forged signatures and fraudulent contracts. Winter's mask of civility finally slipped completely. I'm through negotiating with you people. Miss Harper belongs to me, and I'm taking her back. He raised his hand and is hired. Guns began moving forward with professional precision. But before they could close the distance, the first fat raindrops began to fall, striking the dusty earth with the promise of the deluge to come. Ella lifted her face to the sky, feeling the atmospheric pressure that had been building all morning finally beginning to release. It's starting, she said simply, as if summoned by her words. The storm that would reshape the Colorado Territory opened its fury upon the land. Lightning split the darkening sky. Thunder rolled across the prairie like the voice of God himself. And the rain that had been withheld for 8 long months began to fall in torrents in the chaos of the sudden downpour. With visibility dropping to mere yards and cattle beginning to mill in confusion, the final confrontation between honest men and thieves was about to begin. The Colorado Territory drought was ending, but the fight for its future had only just begun. The storm lantern swung wildly from Coulter's saddle horn as his horse fought to maintain footing on the rain-slicked prairie. Around him, the night had become a chaos of driving wind, blinding rain, and the terrified bellowing of 400 cattle who could no longer see where they were being driven. The lantern's wavering light illuminated only fragments of the disaster unfolding around them. Horn here, a rider's desperate face there, the gleam of water rising where none had been before. Ella! Coulter shouted over the storm's fury, but his voice was lost in the wind. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, she was guiding the massive herd using weather signs that no one else could read, following underground water movements that had suddenly become torrential surface streams. The drought was ending with the violence of nature reclaiming what had been withheld, transforming familiar landscape into something alien and dangerous. A rifle shot cracked through the storm, its muzzle flash briefly illuminating Dr. Winters. Hired guns as they tried to position themselves between the herd and its destination. But the weather was their enemy too, their horses struggling against wind that seemed determined to drive everything living toward the sheltered valleys where Ella's predicted springs were becoming roaring creeks. The cattle are stampeding toward the water. Ben Carmichael's voice reached Coulter through a brief lull in the wind. We're losing control. It was every drover's nightmare, hundreds of terrified animals running blind through a storm. There. Survival instincts overriding years of domesticated docility. But as Coulter fought to stay with the fleeing herd, he realized that Ella had anticipated this. The cattle weren't stampeding randomly. They were following the scent of water toward exactly where she'd predicted the largest spring would surface. Another muzzle flash split the darkness, closer this time. Winter's men were trying to turn the herd, to drive the cattle away from the water sources that would prove their true value. If they succeeded, if they could scatter the animals across the prairie, the entire plan would collapse in chaos. Tom, Jake, Coulter bellowed into the storm. Protect the flanks. Don't let them turn us. The lantern's light caught Tom Morrison's face as he wheeled his horse to intercept 2 riders trying to cut across the herd's path. His rifle spoke twice, and one of Winter's men tumbled from his saddle into the churning mud. But the main danger wasn't the hired guns, it was the landscape itself. Where Ella had predicted water would surface, torrential streams were now carving new channels through earth that hadn't seen flowing water in months. The cattle, desperate for drink after the long drought, were plunging toward these newly formed waterways without regard for the steep banks and treacherous footing. Through the storm's fury, Coulter heard a sound that chilled his blood, the distinctive rumble of hoofbeats approaching a cliff edge, the moment when forward momentum becomes unstoppable disaster. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, the herd was about to charge over a precipice, into the swollen creek that had been a dry gully that morning. Turn them. He screamed, spurring his horse toward where he thought the danger lay. Turn the herd. But his voice was lost in the wind, and his lantern illuminated only rain and confusion. The cattle were following their noses toward water, and nothing short of a miracle would stop them from plunging to their deaths in the churning creek below. That miracle came in the form of Ella Harper. Her voice rose above the storm, not shouting, but singing a strange, wordless melody that seemed to harmonize with the wind itself. Coulter had never heard anything like it. A song that spoke to something primal in both human and animal consciousness, calming terror and replacing it with trust. The stampeding cattle began to slow, their panic subsiding as Ella's voice wove through the storm like a guiding thread. She appeared in the lantern light, soaked to the skin but utterly focused, her arms spread wide as she positioned herself between the herd and the cliff edge. Turn left. She called to Coulter, her voice somehow carrying clearly despite the wind. The safe crossing is 50 yards downstream. He didn't question how she knew, didn't wonder how she could see terrain features in absolute darkness. He simply followed her guidance, using his lantern to signal the other riders as they slowly, carefully, began steering the massive herd away from Disaster Dot. But Dr. Winter wasn't finished. The medicine show doctor materialized out of the storm. Like a vengeful spirit, his silver hair plastered to his skull by rain, his expensive coat torn by thorns and branches. In his hand, he carried a rifle with the steady grip of a man accustomed to getting his way through violence. "That's quite enough," he shouted, leveling the weapon at Ella. "Miss Harper belongs to me, and I'm taking her back." The rifle's barrel gleamed weightily in the storm lantern's light, its promise of death cutting through the chaos like a blade. Around them, the cattle continued their dangerous progress toward water, but the human drama had narrowed to 3 people standing in the eye. Rain with a lifetime of choices balanced on the edge of a trigger. "She doesn't belong to anyone," Coulter said, his hand moving toward his own weapon. "She belongs to whoever can pay her debts," Winter snarled. "And I hold legal claim to those debts." "Forged papers don't make legal claims," Ella said, her voice steady despite the rifle pointed at her heart. Winter's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Try proving that in court, my dear. I've been perfecting the art of legal theft for 15 years. Your word against my documentation will never stand up to scrutiny." The wind gusted, sending the lantern swinging wildly and casting dancing shadows across Winter's face. For a moment, he looked like what he truly was, a predator who'd built his fortune on the suffering of others. A man who viewed human beings as resources to be exploited until they broke. "Maybe not in court," Coulter said quietly. "But we're not in court right now." "No," Winter agreed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "We're not." The shot, when it came, was muffled by the storm, but sharp enough to cut through the wind. For a heartbeat, Coulter thought Ella was dead, thought he'd failed to protect the woman who brought light back into his empty world. But it was Winter who staggered, the rifle falling from nerveless fingers as Marshal Frank Hayes materialized from the darkness with his smoking pistol still raised. "Sorry I'm late," Frank called over the wind. "Had to stop by the telegraph office to send some messages to Denver. Seems there are federal investigators very interested in Dr. Winter's business practices." Winter pressed his hand against the spreading red stain on his shoulder, his eyes wild with pain and fury. "You shot me. I'll have your badge for this." "Actually," Frank said, moving closer with his gun still drawn, "you won't. Turns out when federal marshals start investigating land fraud, territorial badges get a lot more backing. Dr. Silas Winter, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted kidnapping." The hired guns who'd been harassing the cattle drive seemed to evaporate into the storm, their loyalty extending only as far as Winter's ability to pay them. Without their leader, without their purpose, they became just more men seeking shelter from the fury of the weather dot as Frank secured Winter with handcuffs. The storm lantern's light revealed the transformation that had taken place around them. Where dry gullies had existed that morning, flowing streams now carried the promise of renewed life. The cattle, no longer driven by panic, were drinking deeply from water sources that would sustain them through whatever hardships lay ahead. Ella stood in the middle of it all, her face turned toward the sky as rain washed away years of fear and servitude. She had guided them through the darkness, her gift proving its worth in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. "The water's going to keep rising," she called to Coulter, her voice carrying hope instead of warning. "This isn't just the end of the drought. It's the beginning of the richest grazing season this territory has ever seen." The storm lantern swung between them, its light no longer illuminating chaos, but transformation. Around them, the Colorado Territory was being reborn, and they were part of that rebirth survivors who'd found each other in the darkness and chosen to fight for something worth keeping. The silver dollar gleamed in the dawn, light as Tom Morrison placed it in Ella's palm, the first payment for services that had transformed their understanding of what was possible. Around them, the Colorado Territory stretched green and renewed, the violent storm having given way to a gentle rain that continued to feed the springs and streams Ella had predicted with uncanny accuracy. "That's for finding water on my spread," Tom said, his weathered face creasing into the first genuine smile he'd worn in months. "Worth every penny, and then some." Behind him, a line of ranchers waited with their own payments, silver coins and paper money that represented more than mere commerce. Each dollar was an acknowledgement that Ella Harper possessed something invaluable, something that made her worth protecting against any threat. Ben Carmichael stepped forward next, counting out 5 silver dollars with the careful precision of a man who'd learned to respect money through scarcity. "For the Morrison Creek crossing," he said. "Without your guidance, we'd have lost half the herd in that flash flood." Jake Wheeler nodded emphatically. "My cattle are drinking from springs I never knew existed. After 8 months of watching them die of thirst, that's worth more than money can measure." Coulter stood apart from the line of grateful ranchers, watching Ella accept payment for abilities she'd spent 3 years believing were worthless. The transformation in her was remarkable. Gone was the desperate woman he'd found beside a broken wagon, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and wouldn't let anyone diminish it again. Dr. Winter sat nearby under guard, his shoulder bandaged, but his eyes still burning with frustrated greed. Even defeated and facing federal charges, he watched the money changing hands with the calculating gaze of a man who saw everything in terms of profit and loss. "Quite a performance," Winter said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I suppose you all believe she actually predicted those water sources?" Frank Hayes looked up from the paperwork he was completing, his patience with his prisoner clearly exhausted. "I suppose you're suggesting it was all coincidence?" "I'm suggesting that with the right preparation, anyone can appear to have mystical abilities." Miss Harper had access to geological surveys, territorial records, decades of accumulated data about underground water systems. The accusation hit its target with surgical precision. Several of the ranchers looked uncertain, their faith in Ella's gift suddenly shaken by the possibility of mundane explanation. "Show them the survey map," Winter continued, sensing weakness. "The one your marshal friend found in the territorial office. I'll wager it shows every water source the girl predicted with supernatural accuracy." Frank reluctantly pulled out the hidden geological survey, its faded lines and notations clearly visible in the morning light. The correlation between the mapped water sources and Ella's predictions was indeed remarkable, almost too remarkable to be coincidental. "Well," Winter pressed his advantage, "does anyone still believe in magic when faced with simple cartography?" "Tom." Morrison studied the map carefully, comparing its markings to the locations where they'd found water during the storm. His expression grew troubled as the similarities became undeniable. "Miss Harper," he said slowly, "did you have access to this survey?" Ella looked at the document, then at the faces surrounding her. She could lie, could claim ignorance, and maintain the aura of mystical ability that had made her valuable to these desperate men. Or she could tell the truth and risk losing everything she'd gained. "No," she said quietly. "I never saw that map before today." "Then how do you explain the correlation?" Winter demanded. Ella walked to the edge of the newly formed creek, kneeling to place her hands against the muddy bank. For several minutes she remained motionless, her breathing steady as she felt for the subtle vibrations that spoke to something deeper than ordinary senses. "There's another spring about 200 yards upstream," she said finally, pointing to a spot not marked on the survey map. Small flow, probably seasonal, but it should surface sometime this afternoon. Winters. Laughter was harsh as winter wind. More theatrics. Anyone can make predictions that can't be verified for hours. Actually, Frank said, studying the survey map more carefully, this document was created in 1887. It shows the underground aquifer system as it existed 4 years ago. But underground water is constantly shifting, responding to pressure changes, seasonal variations, geological events. He looked up at Ella with growing understanding. The map shows where water was. You're predicting where it is now, and where it's going, Ella added. The storm changed everything, opened new channels, shifted pressure points, created flows that didn't exist yesterday. The old survey is valuable for understanding the general system, but it can't predict how recent changes have affected specific locations. To prove her point, she led the group upstream to where she'd sensed the seasonal spring. As predicted, water had begun seeping through the bank, creating a small but steady flow that would support a dozen cattle through the driest season. The ranchers looked from the survey map to the new spring, beginning to understand the difference between recorded knowledge and living intuition. Maps showed what had been discovered. Ella's gift revealed what was happening in real time. It's not magic, she said, addressing Winter's original accusation directly. My grandmother taught me to read signs that most people ignore: atmospheric pressure, animal behavior, the way ground feels under your feet when underground water is moving. It's knowledge, not mysticism. Knowledge that anyone could learn? Town asked. Anyone willing to spend years practicing, yes. My grandmother started teaching me when I was 7. It took 15 years to develop the sensitivity I have now. Winter's face flushed with renewed anger. So you admit it's just a skill, not a supernatural gift. You've been deceiving these people about your abilities. I've been honest about my abilities, Ella replied calmly. You're the one who insisted on calling them supernatural. I told you repeatedly that weather prediction was knowledge, not magic. You preferred the mystical explanation because it was more profitable. The distinction was crucial, and the assembled ranchers were beginning to understand it. Ella's worth didn't come from mysterious powers, but from rare knowledge coupled with extraordinary sensitivity. That made her valuable in a different way, not as a mystical oracle, but as someone who could teach others to read the land's hidden language. Jake Wheeler was the first to grasp the full implications. Could you teach others? Show us how to recognize the signs you see? Some of it, yes. The basic principles of pressure reading, atmospheric interpretation, understanding how underground water responds to surface conditions. It would take time and practice, but most people could learn to detect major changes. What about the more subtle work? Ben asked. The kind of precise prediction that saved us during the storm? Ella considered the question carefully. That requires a sensitivity that might not be teachable. My grandmother said some people are born with the ability to feel water in their bones, while others have to work much harder for less precise results. Tom Morrison hefted the silver dollar he'd already paid her, then pulled out another to match it. Teaching fee, he said, for showing my sons how to read weather signs. The gesture triggered a rush of similar offers from other ranchers. Not just payment for services rendered, but investment in learning that could benefit their families for generations. Winter watched the money accumulate in Ella's hands with growing desperation. You're making a mistake, he called out. Without mystical abilities, she's just another frontier woman with basic weather knowledge. Maybe so, Frank said, completing his paperwork and preparing to transport his prisoner to face federal charges. But basic weather knowledge is exactly what we need right now. Mystical or not, Miss Harper's guidance saved lives last night. As Frank led Winter toward his horse for the journey to Denver, the defeated man made one final attempt to destroy what he couldn't own. Enjoy your triumph, he snarled at Ella. But remember, knowledge without mystery doesn't inspire the same devotion. When these men realize you're just human, they'll find someone else to follow. Ella looked at the silver dollars in her palm, then at the faces of the men who'd risked everything to protect her freedom. Maybe that's true, she said, but I'd rather be valued for what I actually am than worshipped for something I'm not. As Winter was led away, The morning sun broke through the clouds, illuminating a landscape transformed by the night's storm. Springs bubbled where none had existed before. Streams ran where dust had reigned for months, and the promise of renewal stretched as far as the eye could see. The drought was over, and with it, the artificial scarcity that had made winter schemes possible. The silver dollars in Ella's hand represented more than payment. They were the foundation of a new life built on knowledge, community, and the courage to be honest about both gifts and limitations. The wedding ring carved from ranch. Wood caught the spring sunlight as Coulter turned it slowly in his weathered hands, feeling the smooth grain beneath his fingertips. 6 months had passed since the night of the great storm, and the hay-bar H spread before him like a green promise fulfilled. Where drought-stricken prairie had stretched brown and lifeless, now grass grew thick enough to support twice the cattle. He'd ever dreamed of running. Ella sat beside him on the porch steps, her grandmother's weather journal open across her lap as she recorded the atmospheric conditions that had brought another gentle rain during the night. Her observations had become the foundation of a weather prediction service that ranchers throughout the territory relied upon, transforming her from desperate refugee to respected community member in the span of a single season. The pressures. Steady, she announced, closing the journal with satisfaction. We should have clear skies for the next 3 days, perfect conditions for the community gathering. From the pasture beyond the house came the sound of laughter and celebration. As neighbors arrived for the wedding ceremony, they would join 2 lives shaped by hardship and refined by hope. Tom Morrison's wagon carried his entire family, while Jake Wheeler rode alongside with his sons, all of them eager to witness the union that had become a symbol of the territory's renewal. Frank Hayes approached from the barn where he'd been helping arrange seating for the ceremony. His relationship with Coulter had healed during the months following Winter's arrest, the shared experience of fighting corruption having burned away. 15 years of accumulated resentment. Federal court found Winter guilty on all charges, Frank reported, settling onto the porch beside them. 20 years in prison for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted kidnapping. His Denver associates are facing similar sentences. The news brought closure to a chapter that had threatened to destroy everything they'd built. Winter's land grab scheme had been exposed in its entirety, leading to the return of fraudulently acquired properties and the establishment of new territorial laws protecting landowners from similar predatory practices. What about the other ranchers he targeted? Ella asked. Most got their land back, along with compensation for losses. The federal investigation uncovered evidence of similar schemes in 3 other territories. Winter's arrest probably saved hundreds of families from losing their homes. Coulter thought about the butterfly effect of their decision to fight rather than surrender. One desperate woman's courage to claim her freedom had led to the exposure of corruption that reached from local land offices to territorial capitals. Speaking of courage, Frank continued, pulling an official-looking document from his coat pocket. I have something for you, Miss Harper. Ella accepted the paper with curious hands, unfolding it to reveal territorial certification of her weather prediction services. The document bore official seals and signatures that transformed her inherited knowledge into legally recognized expertise. The territorial government wants to establish a network of weather stations throughout Colorado. Frank explained. They're offering you the position of chief meteorological consultant, with authority to train others and establish prediction protocols. The offer represented more than employment. It was recognition that Ella's abilities served a vital public need, that her knowledge could benefit entire communities rather than individual clients. There's a salary, Frank added with a grin. Enough to make you the highest paid woman in the territory. Ella looked at Coulter, seeing reflection of her own thoughts in his dark eyes. Financial security, professional recognition, the respect of the community, everything she'd never dared hope for during those desperate years with Winter's medicine show. I'll need to think about it, she said finally. Think about what? Coulter asked. It's everything you've worked for. It's everything I thought I wanted, Ella corrected. But wanting and needing aren't always the same thing. From the pasture came the sound of Ben Carmichael tuning his fiddle, preparing to provide music for the ceremony. Around them, the community that had risked everything to protect her freedom was gathering to celebrate the love that had grown from shared danger and mutual respect. The truth is, Ella continued, I've learned something important these past months. My gift isn't meant for institutions or bureaucracies. It's meant for people, individual families, trying to make a living from the land, communities working together to survive hardship. She gestured toward the assembled neighbors, men and women who'd become more than clients or friends. These people don't need an official territorial meteorologist. They need someone who understands that weather prediction is about relationships, not just data. Coulter felt something settle in his chest at her words, a rightness that came from seeing someone choose connection over career, community over status. Besides, Ella added with a smile that transformed her entire face, I have other responsibilities now. She placed her hand over her still flat stomach, and Coulter felt the world shift around him as understanding dawned. The future they'd been building together had just expanded to include another life, another generation that would carry forward the legacy of courage and hope they'd fought so hard to establish. Are you sure? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. As sure as I am about tomorrow's weather, she replied, using her gift as a metaphor for the certainty that came from reading signs. Others couldn't see. Frank cleared his throat diplomatically. I suppose this means you'll be declining the territorial position? I'll be accepting a more important one, Ella said, looking at Coulter with eyes that held the promise of shared tomorrows. Wife, mother, teacher, community weather guide. Seems like a full-time job to me. The wooden ring in Coulter's hand seemed to pulse with warmth as he slipped it onto Ella's finger, the simple band representing everything they'd built from the wreckage of their individual tragedies. Around them, the community that had saved them both began gathering for a ceremony that would celebrate not just their union, but the triumph of hope over despair. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting short shadows across the renewed landscape, Coulter reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely man, slowly losing everything he'd inherited from his parents. Today, he was part of something larger, a family, a community, a future that stretched bright with possibility. The wedding ceremony itself was simple but profound, conducted by Circuit Judge Morrison, beneath the spreading cottonwood tree that had shaded 3 generations of Hayes family gatherings. As Coulter and Ella exchanged vows written in their own words, promising to weather whatever storms life might bring, the assembled community bore witness to something more than marriage. They witnessed the transformation of 2 broken souls into something whole and strong. I promise, Coulter said, his voice carrying across the silent gathering, to shelter you from whatever darkness comes, to trust your wisdom when my own fails, and to remember that the best things in life are worth fighting for. I promise, Ella replied, her words steady with the certainty that came from reading the deepest currents of her own heart, to guide us through whatever storms approach, to share my gifts freely with our community, and to remember that love is the strongest weather pattern of all. When the ceremony concluded and the celebration began in earnest, Coulter found himself standing apart from the crowd, watching Ella move among their neighbors with the easy grace of someone who'd finally found her place in the world. She paused to examine Tom Morrison's grandson's attempt at pressure reading, corrected Jake Wheeler's interpretation of cloud formations, and laughed with the other women about the challenges of reading atmospheric changes while carrying a child. Frank approached with 2 cups of fresh coffee, and the comfortable silence of old wounds finally healed. You did good, cousin, he said simply. We all did good, Coulter replied, watching his wife demonstrate the difference between cumulus and nimbus clouds to a group of fascinated children. As evening approached and the celebration wound down, Coulter and Ella found themselves alone on the porch where their story had begun. The same wooden steps, the same view of rolling prairie, but everything transformed by the journey they'd traveled together. Any regrets? Coulter asked, echoing a question he'd posed months earlier under very different circumstances. Ella considered his words, her hand resting on the journal that had guided them through their darkest moments. None that matter, she said finally. Though I do wonder sometimes what would have happened if you'd ridden a different road that evening. Probably would have found you anyway, Coulter said with the certainty of a man who'd learned to trust in forces larger than coincidence. Some things are meant to be, like water finding its way to the surface, or storms following the paths they're supposed to take. Above them, stars began appearing in the darkening sky, distant and familiar as old friends. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to use Ella's gift in service of their community. There would be other storms to weather, other battles to fight, other moments when courage would be required to protect what they'd built. But tonight, there was peace. Tonight, there was the sound of gentle rain beginning to fall, promising continued renewal for the land they loved. Tonight, there was the warmth of shared silence and the knowledge that some promises, once made, were strong enough to last a lifetime. The drought was over. The corrupt had been defeated, and two souls who'd found each other in the darkness had chosen to build something beautiful in the light. In the end, that was miracle enough for any story, practical magic worthy of the American frontier, and the enduring power of hope to transform even the most desperate circumstances into the foundation of lasting joy.